In 1944, a medical corps report landed on a desk in Whitehall. It had been compiled quietly, without fanfare, and it cataloged something the Army did not particularly want cataloged: a non-trivial percentage of battlefield casualties in Northwest Europe, soldiers dead or seriously wounded before they had fired a single shot in anger, had been caused not by German ordnance, not by enemy action of any kind, but by British equipment, British doctrine, British logistics, and British decisions made years, sometimes decades, before the men who suffered them were even in uniform. The report did not circulate widely. It was not quoted in dispatches. The war was going well enough by then that there was no particular appetite for institutional self-examination. It stayed in the file. This is not a story about bad luck, or about the fog of war, or about the tragic randomness of combat. This is a story about institutional knowledge that existed, was documented, was available to the people who made decisions, and was not acted on. Again and again. Across multiple theaters, multiple campaigns, multiple generations of soldiers who died from the same causes their predecessors had died from, in some cases 70 years earlier. The question this video is asking is not, how did it happen? The record is clear on how it happened. The question is, who knew, when did they know it, and what did they decide to do about it? Private First Class J.A. Saunders, the record gives us his name but not much else, was 22 when he was processed into a training battalion in the autumn of 1939. He'd come from the East Midlands. He was, by the surviving records, unremarkable in precisely the way that most young men called up in the first wave of conscription were unremarkable. His medical record noted flat feet. His co noted adequate performance. His service file records no disciplinary action and no particular distinction. He was the kind of soldier the British Army produced in very large numbers. Not a problem, not a star, quietly competent, expected to survive. He was issued standard kit: wool uniform, standard pattern boots, a gas mask in its cardboard box, a steel helmet, a Lee Enfield No. 4. He was shown how to use all of them. The training manual for the gas mask, which he would have received and which he was instructed to keep close, did not mention that the filter canister lining contained asbestos fiber, or that prolonged use during training drills could create the conditions for inhalation. Nobody in the supply chain had flagged it. Nobody in the training pipeline raised it. The mask was standard issue. Standard issue meant it had been approved. Approved meant it was safe. Saunders is a composite figure constructed from the type, because the archive erases ordinary men efficiently. But the mask was real. The asbestos was real. And the men who wore those masks during the gas drill-heavy period of the phony war were real. What happened to some of them, years later, is documented. He would have known almost none of this. His last normal morning before embarkation, a plate of something forgettable in a mess hall that smelled of cigarette smoke and boiled starch, contained no indication that the thing on his face designed to keep him alive was carrying a slow cargo of harm. The official vocabulary for what this video covers is non-battle casualties. It is a precise, bureaucratically useful phrase that covers a vast amount of institutional failure. It encompasses accidents, equipment malfunction, friendly fire, preventable disease, training deaths, and a category the Army has never been entirely comfortable naming directly. Deaths attributable to equipment or procedural decisions made above the level of the individual soldier, which the soldier had no power to alter or refuse. In the Second World War, the British Army's non-battle casualty rate was, in certain theaters and certain periods, significant enough to influence operational planning. In Italy, in the winter of 1943-44, trench foot casualties were so numerous that some units were temporarily combat ineffective. The British Army had documented trench foot with methodical thoroughness during the First World War. Prevention protocols existed. Dry sock rotations, grease application, revised footwear design proposals, all of it was in the record. Some of it was not implemented. The reasons were logistical and bureaucratic, which is another way of saying they were choices. Here is where the received history starts to diverge from the documents. The standard regimental account of these casualties, where it acknowledges them at all, tends toward a language of inevitability. The conditions were unprecedented. The supply lines were overstretched. These things happen in war. What the logistical records for the Italian campaign actually show is a supply system that had detailed knowledge of the scale of the problem several weeks before it reached crisis point, and a command structure that was managing competing priorities, ammunition, fuel, rations, in which dry socks were not, administratively, a priority. Men's feet rotted. The files show they knew it was coming. The gas mask canisters are worth staying with for a moment because they illustrate a structural problem in how the British military tested and approved equipment. The masks issued at the start of the war used a filter medium that included chrysotile asbestos, white asbestos, as a component of the filtering layer. This was not a secret. It was standard filtration technology of the period, used in industrial and civilian applications across Britain. The hazards of asbestos inhalation were not fully characterized in the scientific literature until after the war, and the causal link to mesothelioma was not established to the standard required for regulatory action until the 1960s. This is where the moral question becomes genuinely complicated. The Army did not know what we now know. The harm was not yet legible, but the mask was approved, issued, and used in training drills that required soldiers to wear it for extended periods in confined spaces. Those are facts. What followed for some of those men, decades later, in a diagnosis that arrived long after the war that caused it had been mythologized into a monument, is also fact. The official history of British wartime equipment notes the gas mask as an example of prudent preparedness. It does not note the filter composition. Before we get to the friendly fire data, and it is more extensive than the official record suggests, this channel covers exactly this kind of history, the gap between the official account and what the documents actually show. If that's the kind of material you want to follow, subscribing means you're here when the next file opens. The most consistently suppressed category of dumb deaths in British military history is friendly fire. Not because it was rare, because it was common, and because every instance of it required an administrative determination. Was this enemy action, or was this ours? That determination was made by the same institutional structure that had a reputational interest in the answer. The British anti-aircraft system in the early war period. The guns positioned around cities, airfields, and ports, operated by Royal Artillery crews who were, in many cases, recent trainees working with instruments that were technically adequate but operationally stretched, had a documented problem with aircraft identification. RAF aircraft returning from operations at night, or approaching their own airfields at angles and altitudes that matched enemy approach profiles, were engaged by their own guns more often than the official casualty records reflect. Several of these incidents are traceable not because they were reported accurately, but because the trajectories of the rounds that killed the aircrew don't match enemy positions. The forensics are in the damage assessments. The attributions, in a number of cases, are in the death notifications to next of kin, killed by enemy action. This is not a claim of deliberate falsification in every case. Some attributions were genuine uncertainty. Some were administrative convenience. Some were, the record suggests, decisions made because the alternative, a formal inquiry into a friendly fire incident involving identifiable artillery positions and identifiable training failures, was operationally inconvenient at a moment when the Army needed its anti-aircraft crews to believe they were doing well. The families were told what they were told. The files said something else. The swagger stick is almost too neat a symbol, but the record insists on it. In the First World War, British officers were visually distinguished from their men by uniform codes that included, in the early years, a requirement to carry a walking cane or swagger stick, a class marker that had migrated into military uniform protocol from the officer corps of the Victorian Army. German snipers used it. They were trained to use it. The casualty rate among junior officers in 1914-15, substantially elevated above that of enlisted men, is partly attributable to the visual identification this convention created. The practice was modified during the First World War as its lethality became undeniable. It was not abolished. It migrated. It persisted in certain colonial theaters, in certain regimental cultures, in the unwritten understanding that officer identity was bound up in a set of visible markers that the Army was not entirely prepared to surrender, even when those markers were getting officers killed. Into the Second World War, the carryover of class-coded uniform signifiers continued to create identification risks that would not have existed if rank had been expressed differently. This is not a dramatic story. It is a slow, grinding, bureaucratic failure, the kind the Army was consistently better at producing than acknowledging. The answer to why it persisted is in the class structure it expressed. That structure had its own gravity. What the Medical Corps report from 1944 concluded, in language as dry as the institution that produced it, was that a meaningful proportion of the non-battle casualties it had reviewed were attributable to what it termed foreseeable and preventable systemic causes. It recommended a series of equipment reviews, a revision of training protocols for cold weather operations, improved aircraft identification training for anti-aircraft crews, and a reassessment of logistical priority waiting for medical and hygiene supplies in extended ground campaigns. The recommendations were noted. Some were implemented with varying degrees of completeness before the end of the war. Others were carried forward into the post-war Army's institutional memory in the diluted form that institutional memory tends to produce. A procedure revised here, a training note added there, nothing that required anyone to stand up and say, plainly, that the failures had been systemic and the costs had been paid by soldiers who had no voice in the decisions that killed them. The report itself was not published. It circulated within the Medical Corps. It found its way, eventually, into the National Archives, where it sat until researchers looking for something else found it. The official history of British military medicine in the Second World War does not cite it. What happened to the men this covers is, in the main, what happens to soldiers the official record finds inconvenient. They became statistics. The trench foot casualties in Italy were recorded. The numbers are in the unit war diaries, which are in the National Archives, which anyone can access. The gas mask casualties, insofar as they appear as casualties at all, are in the long-term health records that were compiled decades later, cross-referenced against service histories, by researchers who had to argue their way into the relevant files. The friendly fire deaths are in the damage assessments, if you know what you're looking for, and if you're prepared to reconcile the trajectory data against the attributed cause of death. That reconciliation has been done by historians. The results are not in the textbooks. The families of some of these men, the ones who knew, or suspected, that the official account didn't quite fit what their fathers or brothers had described before they died, spent years in a particular kind of limbo that the archive creates when it is less than forthcoming. Not lied to exactly, not told the full truth either. The monument at the National Memorial Arboretum lists names. It does not list causes. That distinction matters because cause is where accountability lives, and accountability is what the official record across 70 years has been most careful to manage. Private Saunders, the composite, the type, the unremarkable man from the East Midlands, wore his gas mask during the drills they made him do in the autumn of 1939. He probably didn't think about it much. It was kit. kit was approved. Approved meant safe. Nobody told him otherwise because the people who issued the kit either didn't know or had decided the risk was acceptable or had not asked the question carefully enough to find out. That is the smallest possible unit of this story. A man doing what he was told, with what he was given, by institutions that had access to information they didn't fully act on. The official history calls the Second World War a triumph of organization and national will. In certain respects, it was. In other respects, documented, filed, and not widely read, it was an extended demonstration of what happens when bureaucratic inertia, class convention, and logistical priority setting are insulated from the costs they impose on the people at the bottom. The costs were paid, the files are open. The report is still not in the textbooks,